Hello and welcome everyone to what promises to be an exciting webinar. I'm joining you from Cape Town in South Africa, and I'm sure you're all over the world. This webinar today is organized by the Ethics Working Group of the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition together with the Public Health Emergency and Response Ethics Network. I chair the coalition's Ethics Working Group together with Jennifer Amby. And we'll hope to foster a discussion about some of the work that we've been doing as part of that working group. The coalition was formed in April 2020 by clinical researchers in response to their growing concern that the COVID-19 related research priorities in low resource settings would not be adequately supported or prioritized. The coalition leverages global expertise to advance high impact COVID-19 research in low research settings, advocates for issues of concern to its members, promotes the open sharing of research knowledge and data, and champions equitable and affordable access to vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments proven to be effective. If you're interested in joining the coalition, keep an eye out for resources and links that are shared in the chat. So before we start, just a few housekeeping details. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted later on the coalition website. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask the presenters, you can use the Q&A tool, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you do that, then others can vote up your questions by clicking on the thumbs up icon. And then I'll know which questions are more pressing than others. If you obviously would like to address a question to any of the speakers in particular, then add their name to your question. When you are not speaking, kindly turn off your camera. But if you are speaking because you're asking a question towards the end of the webinar, then please turn on your camera. You feel free to use the chat function to your heart's content and post any observations or questions there. So the focus of today's webinar is multi-site ethics review. And as you are probably well aware, a recurring challenge in ethics review relates to having to submit proposals to multiple ethics committees, sometimes in different countries, often in different institutions. And such multi-site ethics review is a concern, especially when it causes unjustifiable delays and if there is no evidence that multiple or staggered reviews increase protections for participants. This is an issue that we were concerned about in the working group. And then with funding from the WHO, we asked Dr. Vasiliki Rahimzadeh to undertake a short project to map the current landscape around ethics review mutual recognition. And this webinar focuses on her findings and will foster a bit of a discussion about some of her learnings. So in today's webinar, we'll first hear from Dr. Rahimzadeh, who will give us an introduction to the topic and outline the key challenges and opportunities for fostering ethics review mutual recognition. We will then have responses by three panelists, after which we'll foster a bit of a Q&A session. Vasiliki Rahimzadeh is a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and an active member of the Regulatory and Ethics Workstream of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, where she was central to the development of harmonized procedural standards for research ethics committees. She holds PhD and MSc degrees from McGill University and a BS in microbial biology from the University of California. Vaso, over to you.
Good morning. It's morning where I am. I'm joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area in California, and I'm extremely humbled by the international audience we have this morning and to be able to share, as Jantine mentioned, some of the findings of a small undertaking for understanding some of the barriers and opportunities for what we call ethics review mutual recognition, a system of international ethics review and approval, not merely for pandemic circumstances, but of course, accentuated by them. So I'll speak a bit around that topic today. and present, as I mentioned, some of the findings from the report. So I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, and today's talk is entitled "The Ethics Review Mutual Recognition Opportunities and Lessons Learned During the Pandemic." And briefly, the outline for my talk this morning is to introduce the concept of mutual recognition, to hopefully convince you that there is both scientific and ethical imperatives to ensure rapid but yet quality and rigorous ethics review of certainly clinical trial protocols, but also all other health-related and biomedical research that involves human participants during public health emergencies. I will review some of the goals and methods of this ethics working group coalition project that I undertook, including some of the barriers and opportunities that I found through a series of consultative activities, and then leave us for discussion on some of the implications for future policy and guidance. And I really want to start this talk just situating us in the historical context that we're just over 1 year since the first reported case of the novel coronavirus, and the world really continues to grapple with one of the gravest public health crises we've seen in history. And the WHO reports, just as of this morning, 2.4 million people have lost their lives, and this number continues to increase hourly. And you can see the distribution of those cases in the map here. And I draw attention to the scale of destruction, of the pandemic to actually highlight how public health emergencies generally, and certainly this one in particular, can shine a bright light on the scientific and social value of collaboration in research. And public health emergencies are among these rare phenomenon in which time is directly proportionate to lives potentially saved and lost. And scientific progress really needed to establish or reestablish rather the social order is possible only when individuals agree to participate in research and therapeutic and vaccine trial research in our case, and when researchers decide to work together towards common goals. And there are really strong epistemic reasons why researchers should collaborate. Again, not unique to the current crisis, but rather accentuated by it. And that includes the ability to improve the speed with which scientific knowledge is generated, the value of findings when they can be generalized across broader populations and contexts, and really the quality of the inferences we're able to make with improved statistical power. And, as many of you are joining the call, I'm sure are research ethics committee members or have undergone a research ethics committee review for a study that you've led, but really timely, quality, and effective ethics review and continuing oversight are necessary to maximize these scientific benefits accrued through collaboration while ensuring that rights, dignity, and welfare of individuals are universally respected. And research ethics committees, as I've shortened here to RECs, play critical gatekeeping and balancing roles in this regard. And it will come as no surprise to you as that institutional oversight is really the primary charge of RECs, that ethics committees review certainly the ethical permissibility of research involving humans, particularly including population-based and interventional trial research that's typified during public health emergencies. And RECs principally ensure that studies meet rigorous scientific standards, they protect participant welfare and minimize any foreseeable harms, in addition to many of the duties that you see listed on the slide. Yet, despite overlap in these duties really across RECs around the world and across jurisdictions, the variations in the processes and procedures that RECs carry out these duties pose really incredible logistical challenges when research spans across institutions, across regions, and sometimes international borders. And what some of my own empirical research has shown is that REC review proceeds largely on an institution by institution basis, and that can sometimes span across multiple countries. And the data we currently have suggests that this institution by institution model, when applied to multi-site or multinational research, is duplicative in some senses, costly, and significantly delays research efforts without measurably improving participant protections. And it can substantially increase some of the administrative burdens when the sudden and dramatic increase in COVID-19 related protocols involving human participants require multiple recs to review the same study. And these are all areas certainly made worse by the immense time and resource constraints the pandemic imposes on the entire international research community. And so centralization is discussed as a strategy for potentially accelerating research and review during emergencies, and are outlined in many international guidelines. There are many models of streamlined ethics review for multi-site ethics review, rather, embedded in many national ethics review systems. And this slide shows you 4 different typologies of those models that I was able to identify in my research as putting this report together. And there's also a very rich literature base that's describing how these models operate within respective countries and the different types of centralization that can occur. And notably, however, no country to date recognizes the decisions of a centralized ethics review located outside of its own border. So there are streamlined models within a country to attempt to centralize rec review of multi-site studies within the country, but none that extend this sort of reciprocity outside of the border. And there's therefore really this pressing need to explore whether and how ethics approval might be harmonized at a supranational level to accelerate rigorous and otherwise ethical COVID-19 research. And this is indeed the aspiration of ethics review mutual recognition. So this is, I refer to it in the rest of this talk and in the report as a system of ethics review and approval wherein the decisions of one qualified research ethics committee are recognized by another research ethics committee based on shared procedural standards. And this system essentially rests on 2 conditions. The first is that we determine a procedural equivalence, meaning there's an effort to standardize these procedures that are most common across and within qualified and competent research ethics committees. And secondly, that we establish a mechanism of reciprocity, that there is an official recognition granted by a regulatory authority or by a health ministry that oversees research ethics committees in a country to establish this recognition and acceptance of an international rec review. And so it brings me to the current moment in which we, in this report, really hope to landscape some of the barriers and opportunities to such a system, given the current pandemic and given this increased time-sensitive need to accelerate COVID-19 research. And so the first part of this report sought to describe the current state of ethics review equivalency, ethics review mutual recognition, that's published in the empirical as well as the grade literature, again, synthesizing some of those barriers and opportunities studied to date across low and middle income countries specifically, and to evaluate its application in pandemic settings. So there was a horizon scan that I conducted to achieve that. We then sought to take those findings to the real world, and through a series of consultative meetings, identify how current institutions that are reviewing COVID-19 protocols currently approach multi-ethics review in their respective countries. And this was undertaken through a series of individual meetings with members of the Global Coalition and their colleagues. And then lastly, the final deliverable that marries both of those goals together, a policy roadmap of sorts, a practical points and guidance to inform how, whether and how a system of ethics review mutual recognition might move forward. And so the first goal in looking at the horizon scan is I was able to discover 3 different bodies of standards that speak to multi-site and multinational ethics review. And so 2 of those global standards you see are actually outlined in the Standards and Operational Guidance for Ethics Review of Health-Related Research proposed by the WHO, and in specific in Standard 7. And I won't read the whole standard entirely, but the most relevant part of it reads that when a research ethics committee develops reliance agreements for the review of research under its jurisdiction by another REC, it is the responsibility of the delegating REC to assure that the same ethical principles serve as the basis of another research ethics committee's decision-making. So certainly not prescriptive, but rather lays a conceptual foundation that trusting another research ethics committee decision is within, the scope of a competent research ethics committee to do. We also see a standard and really a policy through the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, in which I was a part of drafting. And this policy, termed the Ethics Review Recognition Policy, lays out common elements and essential elements for research ethics committees that have been seen, across the world, and outlines, how this potential international system and approval could build. And it's important to note this standard was developed specifically for data-driven or data-intensive research through mostly in genetics and genomics, and non-interventional research, and didn't have an interventional research bent to it. We also see some national standards, and several of these are really buried in the research regulations that could be invoked to support a system of mutual recognition. And 2 of these include those in the United States. Under the United States Common Rule is what is known as the Equivalent Protections Clause, and also in Canada under Article 8 of its Tri-Council policy statements, both of which again are not prescriptive as to how one goes about recognizing another's review, but simply that should it be granted the appropriate approval, that this recognition could be accepted. And then we see what I'm labeling here as research-specific standards. So meaning that there is a recognized system of centralization, namely in clinical trials. And we see this in the European Union under the clinical trials regulation, and also through AVRF, its joint review for clinical trials, in which there is a supranational, at least a collaborative system of ethics review through various mechanisms for clinical trial research, in specific, again, to streamline, underlying streamline and efficiency as the main goals. And so my colleague, Ted Dove at the University of Edinburgh, has been really an intellectual lead in this area, and much of the work through the Global Alliance and elsewhere really outlines 3 sort of flavors of which ethics review mutual recognition could be constituted. And the first one he talks about is federation, in which institutions, funders, and regulators could create a central REC with representation from multiple jurisdictions. And so this is the model exemplified by AVRF. Namely, we also see delegation. So before an institution or funder or regulator delegates ethics review responsibilities to one or potentially several existing RECs that are designated through a particular agreement. And then lastly, a true model of reciprocity, in which any institution, funder, or government in one jurisdiction accepts the completed ethics review or another, and vice versa, through a collaborative recognition. So these are, I wanted to demonstrate, in addition to the standards, these are some of the models that we see. And so moving on to the second goal, the consultative activities that I conducted are organized in this slide by type and region. So I met with Global Coalition members individually. I attended several webinars and presented this work and ethics review recognition generally through a series of academic presentations and corresponded via email. And then on the right side of the slide, you'll see some of the geographic distribution of those activities. And so I suppose I'm an optimist, a policy optimist, so I like to start with the opportunities. And some of the areas in which we see this overlap are really quite impressive, that there's a unanimous agreement that robust rec infrastructures really yield stronger ethical protections. There's really broad consensus on the roles and responsibilities and structures that are conducive to meeting this first condition I spoke about earlier. So meeting the condition of procedural equivalence could plausibly rest on this broad consensus. I found that really successful harmonization efforts at the regional level, again, exemplified by organizations like PAHO, like AVRF, and in some of my conversations with colleagues in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, a sense of rec mentoring across these jurisdictions, again, not only to accelerate review, but to, in the spirit really of research collaboration. And a second, or at least last but not least, really a shared perceptions on areas of unmet need, so that every person and every webinar I attended really outlined this need for improved rec communication and coordination, and all in some way, shape, or form raised this idea of improved networking among research ethics committees and research ethics committee personnel. And so some of the key barriers here are all in essentially meeting this second condition. So the second condition about establishing reciprocity, that there's a lack of delineated roles between centralized and local research ethics committees, a sense that by ceding review authority to a centralized body, that a local committee loses its sense of duty to local communities, its ability to really protect local values and interests. And more pragmatically, really, this inability to review prior research ethics committee decisions for multi-site studies, that many people I spoke to described not being able to access some of those decisions because of research ethics committee confidentiality standards, and that having decisions, or at least understanding maybe the reasons of a REC decision, a REC decided in one way or another on a particular protocol would be incredibly helpful to informing that specific site's review. And so in unable to meet, establishing this reciprocity standard, some of the key mediating factors I found were that there's a very there's incredible heterogeneity in the regulatory and environments in which research ethics committees operate. That there's a lack of conceptual clarity on the protected roles of local committees, and that the perceived inequities in North-South research collaborations really preclude some of the trust building that's required to recognize another country's review. And so very quickly, what I found was that moving forward in a traditional, policy recommendations avenue seemed premature, and that ultimately underlying the need is actions that can help build trust among research ethics committees. And so first, when research ethics committees coordinate, they really engage in mutual learning and build collaborative networks to better understand common ethical practices and standards in other social, cultural, and political contexts. There's a recommendation really to make prior decisions available for review by other participating RECs, and this is not unique to multinational studies nor to COVID-19 research, but that this recommendation is actually really consistent with other standards that the WHO guidelines have put forth, and should be reinforced in future guidance to facilitate this kind of review. And developing, and really related to that, developing and maintaining a registry of research ethics committees would greatly facilitate this trust building exercise and could be an incredibly useful resource for researchers to anticipate some of the ethics review needs before submission. And one that I think personally is one of the most important here is that for countries that meet or sustain the procedural equivalence determination, that first condition of ethics review mutual recognition, that reciprocity must be established and recognized bilaterally. And by that, I mean that a designation of equivalence flows in both directions, i.e. not just from a determining body to a corresponding body, but both ways. And this feature is really critical to raising REC standards globally and to addressing concerns about inequity that can arise when multinational collaborations involve countries, perhaps with better and less developed REC infrastructures. And then similar to one of a direct response to the barrier that I identified is really clearly delineating some of these review responsibilities between a centralized or a reviewing body and local committees. And because I was able to find so many rich examples of centralization and mutual recognition within countries, that some of these emerging regional experiments to centralize multinational review, as I spoke about with AVREF, and we're so fortunate to have Dickie to speak to that today, and organizations through the clinical trials regulation should really be empirically studied and evaluated. And that I, am, quite a proponent of evidence-based policy. And so claims really that ethics review mutual recognition and related models would improve considerably the procedural efficiency remain at this point really largely theoretical. And so regional efforts to implement standardized and concurrent review among collaborating research ethics committees should be treated as a type of policy experiment from which to learn and compare. And I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to recognize the many, many people who were involved in helping me put this report together and sharing their experiences. It was an incredibly humbling experience for me, and really underscored, the point that any future attempt at mutual recognition must be itself collaborative, cooperative, and proceed from a bottom-up approach. And I wanted to leave or end rather this talk with quite a profound statement made by the president of the Ad Hoc Ethics Committee for Research on COVID-19 vaccine trials of Chile, in which he said, research ethics committees defend human rights, and international agencies should act to empower their ability to continue doing so. And I couldn't agree more with their conclusion, and really look forward to a further discussion with other panelists and to your thoughts in the chat. So I will end it there.
Thank you so much, Vasa, for that excellent presentation. And I also really like the quote at the end, because it shifts the focus from protecting something to actually thinking, well, how do we empower people to protect better? So there's a lot to unpack in your presentation and in the work, and in the broader quest to foster a culture of collaboration between ethics committees. So we are joined today by three panelists who have particular and unique experiences in one or other aspects of ethics review, who I hope will start doing some of that unpacking for us. So I'll now invite the three panelists to each give some short feedback about the impossibility of fostering ethics review mutual recognition. So the first is Kevin Marsh, who is a professor of tropical medicine at Oxford University and a senior advisor to the African Academy of Sciences. He currently chairs the Oxford Tropical Research Ethics Committee based at Oxford University. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Antina, and thanks to the Coalition for asking me to take part in this, and thanks, Vaso, for a fantastic report and presentation. I should probably begin by sort of summarising my positions on this, as it were, which Jantine has already referred to. For a long time, I led an increasingly large and complex research programme in Kenya and was involved in many multinational collaborative projects, and often had occasion to feel quite frustrated at various aspects of how ethical review worked. Over the last 5 years, I've somewhat been a poacher turned gamekeeper, because I now chair an ethical committee, the Oxford Committee, and here this is one of the University of Oxford committees, and we look at the collaborative research by Oxford researchers engaged in collaboration in low and middle income countries. And there's a large amount of research falls into that category, and of course this all involves multinational collaborations. My third position, which I think is relevant to this webinar, is that since the beginning of last year, I've co-led with my colleague Moses Alobo the COVID response in the African Academy of Sciences. And that has involved working very closely with Africa CDC and WHO Afro, as well as other partners, to work with researchers across the continent to define research priorities for COVID in Africa. And many of those discussions have involved priorities for ethical review. Now, one thing that's really consistent, if you'd asked me the question in any of those positions, is whether it's a good idea for ethical committees to work together and more efficiently. Of course, the answer would have been yes, whatever my position. And so that being the case, it's perhaps a little bit surprising for somebody who went to the report and read the conclusions rather than the report to find one of the concluding sentences. And I'll quote from Basso's report now, and she mentioned this in her slides. Issuing WHO guidance on how to operationalize ethics mutual recognition is, at present, premature, based on broad opposition from informants who contributed to this report. Now, of course, when you read the report, it becomes very clear why that is the case, because there are very complex and multiple potential challenges in moving from what everyone agrees is a good idea to actually making it work. Now, I don't want to reiterate all the points that Basso made, and she made them very clearly. I want to just emphasize a couple of reflections on the report and her presentation. I'll do this, as it were, as verbal bullet points, which people can then take up or not, as they choose, in the discussion. And the first point I want to make is a fairly obvious one. Often it's an emergency that precipitates people, galvanizes people into reconsideration of all sorts of practices. But an emergency is not a good place to actually make big decisions about complex and important issues. And this is often reflected in the fact that when these and this may not be about ethics, it might be about anything. Often one ends up saying, well, we didn't quite work it out, but this will be very useful for the next time this occurs. And then people tend to get on with their lives, and the next time it occurs, often the whole process starts again. And I think the key issue here is one that Basso did point out, that there's no reason to consider this to be anything about COVID or anything about epidemics. The point is that if one can make ethical review more efficient without sacrificing rigor, which is what we all say we're aiming at, then this should apply to all ethical review of research globally under all circumstances. The second point that I want to make is that I don't think we should become overwhelmed by our use of terms. When you say multinational collaborative research, you can easily invoke a picture of maybe 20 research groups in different countries on 3 or 4 different continents, all grappling with multiple committees and regulatory frameworks. And if you do that, then you easily put off from the whole idea because it's so complex. But I think we should bear in mind that much multinational collaborative research is not of that nature. It often involves fewer actors, and importantly, those actors often know each other and work together in the past. And I think it's from there that we should begin this process rather than the most challenging issues. My third point is one, again, that Basso emphasized, and that is the importance of empirical approaches. I think this is definitely an area that lends itself to empirical policy research. I do think the AVRA example is a great one, and I'm glad that Dick is going to respond to that. And my final point is to stress something that I think we'd all agree is important, and that is trust. And here I'm not talking about trust between ethics committees, although building that is obviously important. I want to instead finish on pointing out the importance of trust in relation to any international or transnational body that seeks in any way to support or guide the movement towards greater harmonization of ethical review processes. And in this respect, I do think that WHO is in a unique position as a trusted and credible institution. And it's in a way that no other organization, whether it's commercial, coalitions of academics, or charitable foundations, can hope to emulate. So I think it's particularly important that this report was prepared, as it were, with and under this umbrella of WHO. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Jantine.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Some thought-provoking comments and more work on the desk of WHO, I think. Our next panelist is Dickie Akinmori, who is with the Immunization and Vaccines Development Family and Reproductive Health Cluster of the WHO Regional Office for Africa in Congo, where he is also the lead regulation officer for AVAREF, which is the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, which has been mentioned several times as one example of actually already doing ethical or fostering ethics reviews, mutual recognition. So Dickie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and excellent paper, one which obviously has been very well researched and which has attempted to actually not just highlight the need for mutual recognition, but also and convergence, but also has brought this to the fore in the light of the current pandemic. And I think this pretty much, and some of the comments that Kevin made are absolutely spot on. I think that we all want research to be carried out very well. We want research to meet the needs of people and address major public health issues. We would also like research to be carried out properly, well regulated. Reviews are pretty much well done, and you can stand upon the reviews and make decisions. So the experience that we have from the African region is one that is a response to public health priorities, I must say. Since 2006, when AVAREF was established, it's become evident that the only way you can get to a system of reviews, both ethics and regulatory, which meets the needs of researchers, ensures that product development is accelerated, but at the same time that there's quality in the work of these entities, is through building a coalition, building a network. And I think that this coalition has done the right thing by, first of all, trying to bring everybody together. And that's precisely what we did in 2006. We then also realized that there were disparities in systems, in addition, of course, to the lack of clarity in countries, which was a real burden for researchers such as Kevin and myself, who were struggling to do research. And sometimes you're uncertain about how the review will take place and how soon you get a response from your submission. And then the next thing we did, of course, was to try and agree on processes which are common to countries, try to eliminate the ones which are unnecessary, while at the same time ensuring that the quality of the work is maintained, building capacity through joint reviews. And that is what has driven AVAREF to the present position. And just this afternoon, in 1.5 hours, we were able to bring together half a dozen or so countries, together with about 6-7 sponsors, to address an amendment to a common study which is being undertaken in these 6 or so countries. And I think to be able to do this and to reach a conclusion is absolutely fantastic. This is what we would like to see. And this should not just be limited to epidemics or pandemics, but this should be the norm, because we have health priorities which actually claim more lives on our continent than the current pandemic. And yet it takes months to obtain an ethics review if you want to do a study in 3 or 4 countries. And this shouldn't be the case. So, I mean, to conclude, I just want to highlight the need for you to go beyond this. Think about aspects of a clinical trial application or a clinical study, which, having been reviewed, has to be implemented in a different setting. Think about what key areas need to be looked at. What areas should be considered as having been adequately reviewed, because that will help to narrow the difference, because it's difficult for countries to give up. They would like to look at the study, even if it's been very well reviewed and it's been approved by a very competent ethics review committee. So I'll just stop here and then I'll wait for the discussions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Wonderful reflections there, Dickie, and thank you for sharing some optimism that this can be done, no matter how hard it is, and that you're in fact doing it already. So next up is Katherine Litler, who is the co-lead of the Global Health and Ethics and Governance Unit of the World Health Organization in Geneva. Amongst one of her many different tasks, she manages the Global Summit for Ethics Committees and Ethics Councils, which takes place every 2 years. Catherine, we've already heard that some are suggesting WHO has a leadership role here, and you host the summit. I wonder if you can share some of your reflections on the issue at hand.
Thanks, Jantina, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a privilege. And Vaso, thank you for the report and picking up on some of the discussions that I know first came out of the genomics community. So I've been at WHO for 2 years. As Jantina said, I'm the co-lead of the Global Health Ethics Unit, and the headquarters ethics review committee at WHO actually sits within my unit. So I have many hats when listening to this. One as somebody who has responsibility for the secretariat for that review committee, and having talked to Dickie about how we can work more closely and learn from the AVRF. So one, with that hat on, and two, thinking about this in the broader picture with the sense of leadership, WHO leadership in this field, and our other activities, of which Jantina's already mentioned one. So I think I'll start by picking up on a couple of the points that came directly from Vaso's presentation, and then a couple of the points that were raised by Dickie and by Kevin. And then I'll move on to some more of this sort of shared experience, and I think some of the things that WHO is doing and what we could be doing. And it would be great to hear from the audience in the question and section about their thoughts on that. So one of the first things I think Vaso said was really about the change, I think, in ethics review, and that was highlighted by the final comment that she put up. And I do think we are moving from a system that was really much more less focused on being an enabler of high quality ethical research and more back on a rules-based approach. And I think that's shifting. I think that's shifting for the better. And I think areas around mutual recognition will help with that shift. And I think this enabling environment is where we need to start thinking about when we're talking about research ethics committees. So I think that's a really important point. There was a slide that Vaso presented on the challenges of procedural equivalence, you know, the variations in processes and procedures across institutions, countries, regions, and how that presents a barrier, I think, for this mutual recognition model. And I think that is a very practical and real barrier that we have to meet. So one of the pieces of work that my colleague Andreas Rees at WHO is working on is a series of work looking at this procedural equivalence issue and really developing a set of indicators to evaluate the quality of ethics oversight. So really to assess the functioning of research ethics committees, so you can have confidence that they have the same functioning mechanisms and the same processes. And I think that's confidence in the system is critical, but having metrics and indicators to be able to show where that confidence comes from is very important. So I think there are some efforts to look at that issue about procedural equivalence. that I think are important to get right before we can move further along this spectrum of mutual recognition. So that's one piece of work that I think is really important. I think there are some real challenges in terms of legal barriers. So we need to open up a conversation, I think, with legal colleagues about this. A lot of institutions find it hard to recognize other review processes because they want the reassurance within from their own mechanisms from having that. So I think this procedural equivalence format of having real indicators is important. I think opening up discussions with legal colleagues about new modern models and mechanisms for how we do things is also really important. I think exploring the informal in terms of reciprocity and harmonization is critical. So there's the formal, what I was just talking about before with indicators. And then there's the informal. And I think this is all about fostering trust and knowledge sharing. And I think this is where WHO is and starting to and could continue to play a critical role. So Jantine mentioned that we're the secretary of the Global Summit of National Ethics Committees, which is a meeting that takes place every 2 years. We had to postpone the last one because of COVID, but instead actually we had an online one back in September 2020, where we heard presentations from 11 national ethics committees from around the globe, really on their work for how they're operating both research ethics committees in COVID and also national ethics committees, looking at some of the key issues coming out. And I think fostering these dialogues between national ethics committees, both in terms of key ethical issues emerging out of a pandemic and out with, but also in terms of what are the key issues that are happening in research ethics processes that we could learn from each other. That's a critical informal step that I think needs to happen. There are other really good regional examples where this happens, like the FERCAP example. They have meetings, they have an accreditation system. So I think these things are really important. The other area we're really focusing on is an engagement strategy. And this first came out of an engagement and training strategy for our research ethics committees and for technical leads at WHO headquarters. But we started to think more broadly about how can we start doing a series of engagement seminars on key research ethics issues for research ethics committee members. So we're drawing up that strategy at the moment, and we'll build on the lessons learned actually from COVID in two ways, really. One on the seminars we've had as part of the Epidemics Ethics FEPRA network, and that's pulling up key issues that have come out of research ethics committees and the response. So one, for example, has been on adaptive trial design to pull out the key issues that research ethics committees are faced on, including pregnant women studies. What are the dilemmas there? Also one on data sharing. What are some of the issues that research ethics committees are pulling up there? I think our work that we are going to also do as part of this engagement on guidance is critical. Are there topics in which we can help to produce guidance to help with some of the issues that research ethics committees are facing? I'm going to almost stop. I think the critical question and issue that I'm really also interested in, that I think is part of this harmonization question, is the interplay between the global, the regional and the local. What really does need to be made decision-wise, especially for a research ethics committee at a local level, to understand local needs? And what can be done at a regional or at least could be brought together regional groups, and what needs to be done or could be looked at in terms of guidance, for example, at a global level? And I think that question is really important. I want to pick up on one point, 2 points coming up in Dickie and Kevin's talk about trust and confidence. And I think it is really important to build trust in the longer term. In the short term, confidence in systems. Trust is something that can be built over time. And finally, the point that Kevin was saying about efficiency is not just about COVID. I think we've had a really interesting experience with our COVID ad hoc committee, and we want to take some of the efficiency lessons that we've learned with that back to our standing committee. But thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Excellent. Thank you, Katherine, for those reflections and for the enormous amount of work that's already happening. So I'll ask the panelists to just turn their cameras on. So Katherine and Dickie, if you can just turn your cameras on again. So there's a lot there to unpack, and obviously this is not an issue that will be resolved in this webinar. One question that is coming up in the chat relates to a recurring challenge, and Vasa, I think you alluded to this, the possibility or the suspicion or the feeling that local ethics committees are better equipped to think about or address or identify interests in communities, right, and protect communities, coupled with a question, and this comes from somebody who didn't give their name, and then Roger as well, asking, well, does the system of mutual recognition invariably or necessarily lead to a relativist position, or does it force us to adopt universal standards, or is there a degree of variation? So Vasa, I wondered if you could maybe respond to that, and then Dickie, kind of maybe practically, so in the example you gave of the AVRF discussions this afternoon, is that your experience, that recognition at the level that you're fostering it, does that then lead to a universalizing kind of view which doesn't take into account local interests?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I think it speaks directly to one of the barriers I identified, which is this fear that local committees will be superseded by these larger centralized committees that I entirely agree, in which local committees have the best knowledge about local values and interests, and certainly, there are critiques about representation of those values on ethics committees. Certainly, a community member can't, necessarily represent in totality all of the values and priorities of a community, but they are, one practical way in which those values and priorities are embedded in the actual review. And one thing, I really always emphasize in speaking about this topic is that, mutual recognition does not supplant the role of a local ethics committee. So there, within, these different models that we see, there's, and I think Dickie spoke to this too, elements of the ethics review, be it the assessing the scientific rigor, really putting forth a summary of benefits and risks, but again, only a local ethics committee can really evaluate those for themselves. That there are elements of this review that are undertaken centrally, but that there's a required local authorization of that decision. So certainly, in some of the models we've proposed, that we envision a review happening, centrally a decision is made, but that a local committee absolutely could dismiss that decision and decide that the research doesn't take part there. And I think that's an important point, because it's where we see the most resistance, is this misconception that local committees will be completely supplanted. And so I would only agree to say that I do think local committees are in the best position to make assessments, especially on risks and benefits and community values and priorities that make it into the central review in that local authorization.
Thank you, Vasa. And Dickie, so your reflection on the same issue about relativist versus universal kind of ethics and how that works in the AVRF context.
Oh, thank you very much. This indeed is a very important point to raise. Indeed, ethics begins with the community, begins with the society, begins with the exact location where the study is intended to take place, because those are the people who are the subjects of the study. And we in the AVRF model have recognized this, which is why we ensure that for these joint reviews, you have the local IRB present, as well as a national ethics committee where required, but trying to ensure that there's no duplication, but that all the issues are raised. So this afternoon, in the meeting we had, these groups, on the one hand, the regulators and ethics committees, including IRBs, met with not just the sponsors, because the other point which we need to emphasize is the fact that you do have a sponsor, but that sponsor may be located outside of the region or the country, but has investigators who are locals in the country or the settings or working at a particular site. And again, you need to bring them into the review directly and not just have them as investigators and then have an engagement of the sponsor with the ethics or the committees or the IRBs. So we ensure that in the model that we currently use within AVAREF, that we do not ignore the local IRB involvement. And I think that this has been clearly emphasized in the first response, indicating the value of having local IRBs or having the local ethics committee involved in the review process. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. There's a question which hasn't been asked, but I'm going to use chair prerogative and ask it anyway, and that is that it strikes me that one of the lowest common denominators in fostering, or moving towards some degree of recognition or trust is to share the deliberations by ethics committees, right? So having some kind of fostering transparency. I wanted to kind of ask maybe Kevin and Katherine to just reflect a bit on why is that not happening? So I know there's a lot of resistance to the releasing of ethics reviews and even deliberations, right? Like kind of minutes of meetings or something like that could help other ethics committees understand what has been identified as ethically problematic. And so I wonder if you could say something, maybe Kevin first, about what might help ethics committees move towards such a model.
Yeah, well, I think this is incredibly important, and I don't see any reason why one can't move towards that. I don't want to overclaim for what we do, but one thing we're always very keen on is to have colleagues from other ethical committees sit in our meetings, and we would happily sit in theirs too. This hasn't been developed as far as we'd like to, but I think we are moving in that direction quite fast of basically having people observe each other's meetings and see the kind of discussions which go on. And when we've done that, it's been extremely successful from the point of view of people have really valued it from all sides. So I'm totally in support of this. I don't see I'm not really thinking about any legal issues here. I just think that it's really key that there is transparency. And why would you not have transparency? Certainly between committees, absolutely.
Katherine, any views on that question, or the other panelists?
I mean, I would like to comment briefly, and I think I fully agree with Kevin on this. I mean, what we have done in AVAREF is pretty simple. At each joint review, we have the participating countries which would have received the application and are reviewing the application. We have the sponsors, we have the principal investigators, and in addition, we have a category called observers. Now, these are often countries which would not have received the application, but with at the request of, say, approval from the sponsor and the other participating countries, we allow them to participate in the joint review. They come there merely as observers, they listen in, and they go back with the practices, but at the same time, they also get to see whether this process was fair or not. What was it that was said, which, and I think that helps to bring some more transparency in the process. Of course, it would be good for us to consider how reports can even be made publicly available on the website. After all, somebody has submitted a request, you've reviewed it, you've given the person a response. What makes it so secret? Why shouldn't others be able to access these documents later and see how the process worked? Because that's how we build trust. That's how we get people to understand the value of research, the importance of research, and the need for a clear and a very transparent process of engaging participants in research. Thank you.
And
Wonderful.
might I just add one very quick point onto the transparency is that, I think there are obvious benefits to transparency, but one that's not talked about a lot and what's, I exemplified in this observer model is that this is an opportunity for capacity building. So there are very few resources to teach research ethics committee members how to be a good research ethics committee member. And I think, there really isn't a substitute for living and experiencing and observing, if you will, how these processes unfold. And I noticed there's a question in the chat also about unethical research making it through the approval pipeline. And I think part of that is really emphasizing and investing in good research ethics committee membership training that this transparency, greater transparency could really facilitate also. So it's sort of a double benefit, two birds, one stone of sorts.
Wonderful. Well, rests me nothing other than to thank all the panelists and all the participants for all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to address all of them. Obviously, a topic that needs further discussion, as well as the development of an evidence base, which I think is critical to support some of the recommendations, as well as some of our assumptions about what ethics committees do and are, and when they're most effective and when they're not. Thanks to all the participants for joining. When you log out, there is a prompt to a feedback short questionnaire, a request to please fill that in and not just click it away. It'll also be emailed to you if you do, and I can't say that we're tracking whether or not you complete the questionnaire, but it'd be lovely if you could and let us know what you thought. Please get in touch with the Alliance if you wanted to follow up on any of this. They can put you in touch with me or Jennifer and the working group, or Vaso or others if needs be. Thanks to everyone, Maureen for excellent assistance, and Julie for making it possible, Katherine and Vaso and Dickie and Kath and myself, I guess, for this wonderful event.